My grandma Juanita had a business card that she'd made for herself, printed on purple paper. It read, Dr. Juanita D. Sanford, sociologist, consultant, and freelance agitator. I think about that line all the time, freelance agitator, and for some reason it always makes me smile. I can remember asking my parents what that meant and them laughing. So my grandma Juanita and her purple business card were the first images to flash through my mind when I heard about the DIY theme for September. The idea of DIY could not be more appropriate for this time in our lives. As a wise woman told me recently, our lives are all kind of DIY right now to some extent, and a little or a lot messy. The past few months, at least in my experience, have been about a greater familiarity with the unknown, about learning to sit with messy truths, and about reframing or eliminating expectations to align with our current reality. To touch on this slightly, I have to admit that I would really like to be coming to you right now from your beautiful sanctuary. But this is not the year that any of us envisioned, and so I come to you this morning from my Louisiana living room. And yet, the current circumstances also provide an opportunity for us to journey into the unknown together, to reframe expectations, to try something new, to be creative. To DIY, at least for me, is about making it up as you go along, about experimenting, finding what works, and I think it's really important to highlight this part, tossing out what doesn't, accepting that it might take a few tries and a few mistakes to get there. In this way, we're granted a kind of permission, a knowledge that there's no right way and that we get to make our own, to find what works for us. I'm reminded of the freedom of a blank page or canvas. In a way, it's exciting, but it's also scary for the exact same reasons. It brings up this sense of moving forward into newness, not knowing exactly what the finished product will be or what it will look or feel like, to open ourselves to uncertainty and to do it anyway. As someone who is most comfortable in ambiguity, with many ways of doing the same thing, this is where I thrive. I am a project person, someone who likes to have many different things going on at once, to create and rearrange until it feels right. And embracing the call to ministry is probably the biggest project I have ever taken on in my life. It's also true that I wouldn't be here without the roots that held me tightly when I needed it and helped me to forge new pathways in the dirt when I didn't yet know the way. Grandma Juanita was warm and soft and kind, in a lot of ways exactly the way you would imagine a grandmother. 5 feet tall and smelling of soap and lavender, Juanita would greet us at the door dressed in a purple t-shirt and pants, her white hair piled high on her head, big glasses slipping down her nose. I have vivid memories of visiting my grandparents' house as a child and the disbelief I felt that an adult could have a house where almost everything was purple. I remember holding the bathroom soaps in my hand, amazed at the little purple roses they formed. The walls adorned with quilts hand-sewn by Juanita, and by the door was an altar where she lit candles. Whenever she knew someone was traveling, going through a difficult time, or just needed connection, I remember her saying, "Okay, I'll have my candles going." An acknowledgement that our spirits were held, that she held us close. I want to highlight here that Juanita and I shared no blood relationship, only that of love. When my mom's mother passed away, she and Juanita drew closer, eventually developing a mother-daughter type of relationship. Without question, she and Herman adopted me, my sister, and my brother as their own grandchildren, embodying for me the tendency to DIY relationships, to go her own way, to love those who needed loving. Generational wisdom can come as much from chosen family as it can from our families of origin. And relationships are complicated and complex for all of us, each having their own nuances and texture. Not everyone has grandparents or has the chance to be a grandparent. There is something so special about intergenerational communities like this one, where we can connect and learn from each other. Growing up, I often felt that at church I was surrounded by many grandparents, adults willing to share what they knew and who cared for me. And I'm sure that many of you have felt it too. Whenever we would visit her house, she and my grandpa Herman, their kids, and my parents would share stories, like families do when they're all together. I remember hearing how she took her daughters to hear Dr. King speak in Little Rock, and hearing stories of them holding student meetings open to anyone, regardless of race, in their living room. Later, Juanita told of her fear for her children when, later that night, a brick shattered their front window. She researched poverty in Arkansas, eventually writing a book entitled Poverty in the Land of Opportunity, a jab at this country that has failed to deliver on its promises to so many for so long. I think now that what she meant by freelance agitator was just the willingness to be annoying, to keep asking the questions, to keep pointing out wrongdoings where she saw them, to keep disrupting systems of injustice, even when it wasn't convenient. Those questions didn't come without struggle or without pain, though. Over time, she began to question the Baptist tradition in which my grandpa Herman was an ordained minister. As the constraints of the role of minister's wife closed in, she latched onto feminism and eventually left the church, feeling that her faith was bigger than any one denomination or eventually religious tradition. Later on, Herman would do the same. I remember hearing her talk with my mom about her chronic illness, about getting older, about her kids, and very often about what might come after this life. These were the kind of questions or conversations I lived for as a child, to know what people thought about who God is, what was hard about their lives, and what they thought might come next. Without even knowing it, she nourished the minister in me. She fed my curiosity. To DIY implies that change is happening constantly, that we are at work building a different kind of worlds. Our reading earlier this morning reminds us that we are beings forever in process, but we are not in that process alone. My grandmother was one in a long line of people encouraging me to look, listen, to pay attention to that. One of my guides to my current path that has led me to stand before you this morning. She saw me when I was just a young girl who loved to read. She sent me books and journals and wrote me letters and told me never to stop reading and writing. She nourished my education and she loved me. There was physical distance between us, but we always visited and I felt close to her. A lot of what I know to be true, I have learned by watching others. I share these tidbits and images of my grandmother's life because in them are pieces of wisdom, passed down to me not explicitly, but there for the taking. The wisdom to hold tight to those you love, to question systems of oppression, and when necessary, authority. The wisdom to pay attention to what lights you up inside, to what makes you feel alive. the wisdom to ask the difficult questions about life, to lean into deep conversations, the wisdom to wonder about what comes next, and the wisdom to love those who need it. I'm not saying that wisdom from those who have come before necessarily makes life easier, but I am saying that on difficult days, when our world feels uncertain, when I'm in the middle of a project and not sure where it's going, I think about what it must have been like for Juanita in South Arkansas in the 1960s, a Baptist minister's wife, discovering feminism and questioning the faith of her childhood, organizing with students for racial justice, working in academia, and raising daughters. I try to feel what that would have felt like in my body. And I remember that she kept going and did it with laughter. She kept organizing and agitating, kept asking the hard questions. And somehow I feel a little more held, a little less alone, a little more rooted, a little more like I can finish the project. To know that others have come before doesn't necessarily make life easier or less painful. But there's some comfort in knowing that across time and death and the space between the stars, we are never really alone. I know that my family's story is not unique and that so many of you have stories like these two that you hold near and dear to your heart. I wonder who you might feel guiding you now, here or from some other place. When my grandmother died in 2016, I wasn't even sure about applying to divinity school yet. But of course I said yes when my mother encouraged me to be a part of the celebration of her life. My hands shook in the pulsing heat of the Arkansas summer as sweat ran down my back. I read, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." As we stood by her casket, topped with purple flowers, it became clear that she was still teaching me, slowly moving me toward my call to ministry, even from beyond this life. In the coming days and weeks, my mom let me know that what we had done at the graveside was appreciated by her family. They felt it was right, and I heard in that we had honored Juanita in a way that was meaningful for those who loved her, myself included. I began to understand the honor of the work of ministry, and I knew that this was my path. As the prayerful hymn, Spirit of Life goes, roots hold me close. And I wonder this morning, who has held you close? Who has guided you when you didn't know the way? We are endlessly formed and formed again by those who love us into being. Wisdom is passed down from generation to generation as the rivers of time roll onward. I wonder, to whom will you pass all the knowing you hold within you? Who have you taught without realizing it? How have you made pathways in the dirt for those who were unsure of the way?